It wasn't romance. It wasn't tradition. It wasn't even scarcity. It was a structural necessity, a mechanism designed to save a monopoly from the merciless arithmetic of supply and demand. We look at a diamond engagement ring, and we see a symbol of eternal devotion. We assume it is a custom stretching back to the medieval courts of Europe. We assume the stone itself is rare. We assume it holds value like gold or land. The pattern is unmistakable, the history is clear, and the reality is much colder. Modern diamond market is not a market at all. It is a price-fixing arrangement that was sustained for a century by a single entity, an entity that understood one terrifying fact about their product. If the world ever understood that these stones are common, the value would fall to zero. The incentive is survival. The method is restriction. The result is the most successful marketing campaign in human history. This isn't prophecy. It's positioning under constraints. When you control the supply of a commodity that has no intrinsic utility for the average buyer, you have a problem. You cannot eat it. You cannot live in it. You cannot burn it for heat. Its value is entirely derived from the perception that it is precious. If that perception cracks, the asset class evaporates. To understand how this illusion was built and why it is currently fracturing, we have to look at the architecture of the cartel. We have to look at the men who stared at the abundance of the earth and decided to hide it. We have to look at the advertising executives who sat in a room in Philadelphia and decided to rewrite the social contract of the Western world. Here is the key. They didn't just sell a product. They sold a mandatory tax on marriage. They sold a financial hallucination. And for 80 years, the world paid the bill. But the constraints are shifting. The technology is changing. And the monopoly that held the floor price is gone. The arithmetic is merciless. When the supply becomes infinite, the premium becomes impossible. To understand the scale of the operation, we must go back to the moment the threat first appeared. We must examine the first case file, the supply shock of the late 19th century. The year is 1866. The location is the banks of the Orange River in South Africa. Until this moment, diamonds were genuinely rare. For 2,000 years they had trickled out of riverbeds in India and the jungles of Brazil. They were the exclusive province of Maharaja's kings, and the highest tier of European aristocracy production was measured in pounds, sometimes ounces per year for the entire globe. Scarcity was a physical reality. There was no need to manufacture it. Then a 15-year-old boy named Erasmus Jacobs found a transparent stone on his father's farm. He didn't know what it was. He played with it in the dust. A neighbor saw it. It was eventually identified as a 21-carat diamond. The Eureka 3 years later, a shepherd found an 83-carat stone nearby. The star of South Africa. The rush began. But this wasn't like the gold rushes of California or the Yukon. This was different. In gold mining, the more you find, the rich you get. But the global price of gold remains relatively stable because the stock-to-flow ratio is massive. Gold is money. The world can absorb it. Diamonds were a luxury novelty. The market was tiny. Thousands of diggers descended on the region that would become Kimberley. They dug into the earth, and they found something that terrified the financiers in London. They didn't just find a few stones. They found volcanic pipes, vertical shafts of blue ground that went deep into the crust filled with diamonds. The supply was not just increasing, it was exploding. Think about the economics. In 1871, the output from the Kimberley mines alone exceeded the entire previous history of diamond production. The market was flooded. The price of diamonds began to crash. The stones were becoming common. They were appearing on the fingers of waitresses and shop clerks in London and Paris. The exclusivity was dying, and if the exclusivity died, the asset was worthless. Enter Cecil Rhodes, an English vicar's son with weak lungs and an iron will. He arrived in Kimberley not to dig, but to service the diggers. He sold ice, he pumped water, but he watched the market. He understood the constraint before anyone else. He realized that competition was the enemy of value. If 10,000 independent miners were all digging as fast as they could to pay their debts, they would flood the market and destroy the price for everyone. The incentive for the individual miner was to dig faster. The result for the industry was suicide. Rhodes saw that the only way to save the only industry was to stop the mining, or rather to control it. He needed to own every single claim. He needed to turn a free market into a dictatorship. The arithmetic was simple: control the pipe, control the flow, set the price. Rhodes spent 2 decades maneuvering. He used financing from the Rothschilds. He used political leverage. He engaged in a ruthless corporate war with his rival Barney Barnado. By 1888, the dust settled. Rhodes had won. He formed De Beers Consolidated Mines. At that moment, a single board of directors controlled practically the entire global supply of diamonds. This was the positioning. Rhodes didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be the gatekeeper. He immediately reduced production. He closed mines that were profitable but unnecessary. He throttled the supply to exactly match the demand of the world's elite. He turned the diamond from a commodity into a financial derivative of his own power. For the next 40 years this system worked. The syndicate, as it was known, operated from London. They held the sites. 10 times a year, invited buyers would come to a room in London. They would be handed a shoebox of stones. The price was written on a piece of paper. There was no negotiation. There was no haggling. You bought the box at the price stated, or you were never invited back. It was a perfect machine. The price of diamonds was not determined by geology. It was determined by a boardroom decision. But a monopoly on supply is only half the equation. You also need a monopoly on desire, and that brings us to the second case file. The demand crisis of 1938. The Great Depression had shattered the global economy. The American middle class was broke. Europe was sliding toward war. The price of diamonds had collapsed again, not because of supply, but because nobody had any money. Sales in the United States, the biggest market, had fallen 50%. Even worse, the cultural perception was shifting. Young people in the 1930s didn't want engagement rings. They wanted washing machines. They wanted cars. They wanted things with utility. Diamonds were seen as frivolous, a waste of money in hard times. The tradition of the diamond engagement ring was fading. In Germany, Austria, and Italy, it had never really existed for the common people. In England and France, it was reserved for the aristocracy. The De Beers cartel, now led by the Oppenheimer family, who had succeeded Rhodes, faced an existential threat. They had warehouses full of stones in London, and nobody to buy them. The constraint was demand. The incentive was to manufacture a new social norm. They needed to psychologically condition the public to buy their product, regardless of the economic conditions. In 1938, Harry Oppenheimer traveled to New York City. He met with N.W. Ayer, a prominent advertising agency. The brief was simple: make Americans buy diamonds. But not just the rich Americans. All of them. The agency conducted a deep psychological study. They found that men were the buyers, but women were the drivers. They found that the diamond needed to be decoupled from its monetary value and attached to something emotional, something irrational. If a man bought a diamond as an investment, he might sell it, and if he sold it, he would realize the resale value was terrible. He would realize the markup was massive. So they had to make sure he never sold it. They had to make the diamond a symbol of something that could never be broken. The strategy was brilliant and insidious. They didn't just run ads. They infiltrated the culture. They gave diamonds to movie stars to wear on screen. They planted stories in the society columns of newspapers describing the size of the stones given to debutantes. They sent lecturers to high schools to talk to teenage girls about the history and romance of the diamond engagement ring. They created a curriculum. They taught a generation that a marriage without a diamond was incomplete. Then in 1947, a copywriter named Francis Geraghty wrote 4 words on a piece of paper: "A diamond is forever." It sounds like a proverb. It sounds like a fact of geology. It isn't. It is a command. It tells the buyer, do not resell this. Keep this off the market. Hold this until you die, by convincing the public that diamonds were forever. De Beers removed the vast majority of the inventory from the market. Every engagement ring sold was a stone taken out of circulation. It went into a jewelry box, never to compete with the new stones being mined in South Africa. It was a sink for supply, but they went further. They needed to anchor the price. They noticed that men didn't know how much to spend, so N.W. Ayer invented a rule initially. They suggested 1 month's salary. They put it in magazine ads. 2 months' salary came later in the 1980s. Think about the audacity of this. A private corporation created a social tax. They dictated that every young man starting a family must transfer 8 to 16% of his annual pre-tax income to the cartel in exchange for a rock. And the world obeyed. By the end of the 1950s, the conversion was complete. In 1939, very few American brides received a diamond. By 1960, it was over 80%. They had successfully monetized the concept of love. They had positioned themselves as the toll collectors on the road to marriage, but history does not stand still. Constraints evolve, and in the second half of the whole 20th century, the geology began to fight back. This leads us to Case File 3, the geopolitical fracture. The monopoly relied on one thing. All diamonds must go through London. If a major mine was discovered outside of De Beers' control, and those miners decided to sell directly to the market, the price fixing would collapse. In the 1950s, massive diamond deposits were found in Siberia. The Soviet Union became a major producer. The Soviets were not capitalists. They didn't care about market stability in the same way. They wanted hard currency. They wanted to dump their stones for dollars. This was a lethal threat to the cartel. If the Soviets flooded the market, the price would crash. So Oppenheimers made a deal with the enemy. De Beers agreed to buy the entire production of the Soviet mines. Every single stone. They paid a guaranteed price. They took the Soviet inventory into their own vaults in London. They effectively paid the Soviet Union protection money to keep the market stable. This arrangement lasted for decades. It survived the Cold War. Capitalism and communism shook hands over a table of diamonds. But there was a problem. The Soviet diamonds were small, mostly under half a carat. De Beers was used to selling big engagement solitaires. They had a glut of small stones, so what did they do? They went back to N.W. Ayer. They needed a new product. They invented the eternity ring, a band of small diamonds given to a wife later in marriage, to show her you'd marry her all over again. It was a marketing solution to an inventory problem. They needed to clear the Soviet stock, so they invented a new tradition. The pattern repeated in Australia. The Argyle mine was discovered. It produced millions of carats of low-quality brownish stones. Industrial-grade De Beers didn't want them, but they couldn't let them hit the market as cheap diamonds, so they rebranded them. Champagne diamonds, cognac diamonds. They turned waste product into a luxury category through the sheer force of marketing. For decades, this high-wire act continued. De Beers bought up surplus from Zaire, from Angola, from Russia. They managed the buffer stock. When demand was low, they held back supply. When demand was high, they released it. They smoothed the curve. They acted as the central bank of diamonds. But gravity always wins. By the 1990s, the dam was leaking. The Canadians found diamonds in the Northwest Territories. The Australians broke away from the cartel. The Russians started selling direct. Antitrust regulators in the U.S. and Europe finally started closing in. The market share of De Beers dropped from 85% to under 40%. The monopoly was broken. A single channel was gone, and yet the price didn't collapse immediately. Why? Because the idea was still intact. The programming of the 1940s was so deep that even without the monopoly, the public still believed. Momentum of the illusion carried the market for another 20 years. But now we are facing the final constraint, the one that cannot be marketed away, the technological singularity of the gemstone market, lab-grown diamonds. This brings us to the mechanism of the collapse, the 7 stages of the diamond illusion, a pattern that dictates how this story ends. Stage 1 is the geological reality. Carbon is one of the most common elements in the universe. Turning carbon into crystal requires heat and pressure. Nature does it deep underground, But physics is physics. If you can replicate the conditions, you can replicate the result. For a century, synthetic diamonds were gritty industrial dust. Good for drill bits, bad for jewelry. The cartel felt safe. Stage 2 is the technological leap. In the last decade, the technology to grow gem-quality diamonds in a lab moved from experimental to industrial. Chemical vapor deposition, CVD, high-pressure, high-temperature, HPHT, these are not fakes. They are not cubic zirconia. They are atomically, chemically, and optically identical to mined diamonds. Even a jeweler with a loupe cannot tell the difference. They need a specialized machine to detect the growth patterns of the crystal. The only difference is the origin. One came from a hole in the ground. One came from a plasma reactor. Stage 3 is the denial. The natural diamond industry reacted exactly as you would expect. They attacked. They called them synthetic. They called them real is rare. They tried to frame the lab-grown stones as cheap, soulless, and inferior. They spent millions on advertising to reinforce the natural narrative. A diamond is forever only if it's real. They tried to position lab-grown diamonds as costume jewelry. Stage 4 is the price divergence. This is where the arithmetic takes over. A mined diamond has a high floor price because of the cost of mining exploration and the cartel-esque legacy pricing. A lab-grown diamond has a cost structure like a microchip. Moore's law applies. As the technology gets better, the price goes down. 5 years ago, a lab-grown diamond traded at a 20% discount to natural, then 50%, then 80%. Today, the wholesale price of lab-grown diamonds is in freefall. You can buy a stone for a few $100s that would cost $10,000 if it were mined. Stage 5 is the consumer arbitrage. The consumer is rational. They stand at the jewelry counter. On the left is a 1-carat mined diamond for $6,000. On the right is a 15-carat lab diamond for $800. They look identical. They sparkle the same. Nobody at the dinner party will know the difference. The young couple, burdened by student loans and high housing costs, looks at the math. The incentive is overwhelming. They buy the lab stone, or they buy a bigger lab stone for a fraction of the price. The status signal of the diamond is broken because you can no longer tell how much money was spent just by looking at the rock. Stage 6 is the liquidity crisis. This is the stage we are entering now. As lab diamonds flood the market, the perceived value of all diamonds is questioned. If a perfect diamond costs $500 to manufacture, why is the mined one worth $10,000? Just because of its story? The secondary market for natural diamonds is freezing. Pawnbrokers and jewelers are wary of buying back natural stones. They know the market is softening. They know that the customer who buys a natural diamond today is buying a depreciating asset. The investment argument is dead. The store of value argument is dead. Stage 7 is the reversion to utility. Eventually, the price of the commodity falls to its marginal cost of production. Diamonds will become like aluminum. Once aluminum was more precious than gold because it was hard to refine. Napoleon III served his honored guests on aluminum plates and the rest on gold. Then we figured out electrolysis. Aluminum became cheap. We wrap our sandwiches in it. It is still useful. It is still a great material. But it is not a store of wealth. Diamonds are heading for the same fate. They will be used for semiconductors, for drill bits, for high-end optics, and yes, for pretty jewelry. But they will be cheap. Mapping this to the present day, the signs are everywhere. The major miners are panicking. De Beers actually launched its own lab-grown brand, Lightbox, priced cheaply. The strategy was to destroy the perceived value of the lab-grown market. To say, look, these are cheap trinkets, not serious items. But the strategy backfired. It just validated the product. It told the consumer. Even De Beers sells these now. Current data suggest a massive shift in the engagement ring market. In 2023, sales of natural diamonds for engagement rings were down double digits. Sales of lab-grown were up double digits. The crossover has happened. The tradition that NWA are built is being dismantled by the microchip of the jewelry world. There is a counter-argument. The industry argues that luxury is not about rationality. They point to Hermes bags or mechanical watches. A Rolex tells time worse than a Casio, yet the Rolex costs $10,000 and the Casio costs $20. Why? Craftsmanship history scarcity. They argue that natural diamonds will become like art, rare natural anomalies that hold value asterisk because asterisk they are natural. They argue that the market will bifurcate cheap lab stones for the masses, rare natural stones for the elite. This is a plausible scenario, but there is a flaw in the analogy. A Rolex is branded. It is recognizable. You know it's a Rolex. A diamond is a raw material. Unless it is laser inscribed and certified, you cannot tell the difference. And the scarcity of natural diamonds is still artificial. There are billions of carats of diamonds in the earth. The only reason they are rare is because it is expensive to dig them up, not because they don't exist. Furthermore, the resale value of a Rolex is real. The resale value of a commercial-grade diamond has always been a mirage. Try to sell a ring you bought for $5,000 back to the jeweler. You will be lucky to get $1,500. The public is waking up to this spread. The end game is approaching. We can see three potential futures. First, the controlled decline. The luxury brands Cartier, Tiffany, Bulgari double down on natural. They stop selling the stone and start selling the brand. You aren't buying a diamond. You are buying a Tiffany diamond. The premium shifts from the material to the logo. The generic diamond market collapses, but the branded luxury sector survives as a boutique niche for the ultra-rich. Second, the chaotic collapse. The flood of lab-grown stones becomes so cheap and so ubiquitous that the cultural cachet of the diamond evaporates entirely. If everyone has a 3-carat stone, nobody cares. The fashion cycle moves on. Maybe we go back to gold or sapphires or something else. The diamond becomes tacky. The billions of dollars of inventory held by banks, miners, and families lose their paper value overnight. This is the aluminum moment. Third, the reset. The industry pivots entirely to industrial applications. We stop thinking of diamonds as jewelry and start thinking of them as the ultimate semiconductor material. Diamond wafers replace silicon. The diamond age of computing begins. The value of the material is massive, but it is utilitarian, not decorative. The engagement ring tradition dies out, a relic of the 20th century. The only variable is timing and pain. For the family holding grandmother's ring, the pain is emotional and financial. The inheritance is worth less than they thought. For the miners, the pain is existential. For the consumer, it is a liberation. The tax is being repealed. The lesson of the diamond cartel is not about geology. It is about the fragility of value. Value is a consensus. It is a story we agree to believe. When the story changes the value, vanishes. Rhodes and Oppenheimer wrote a story that lasted 100 years. But the book is closing. Subscribe.